Thank you all for joining us in this special Kumi event where we are launching Sabil and Reverend Naeem's newest booklet on Christian Zionism. Today is a blessing. We have two wonderful friends, two wonderful speakers from two empires, actually. One from the belly of the monster, the UK empire, and one from the living and well and healthy empire of the United States, Don Wagner, joining us. Both are genuinely the authorities on Christian Zionism. So thank you for being with us. We're going to be starting in the coming few minutes. This session is being recorded, so if you do not want to appear in a recording in an online event, please just switch off your camera feed. So we're 100 participants as we speak now, which is a magical number, a good number. So please, if you're able and if you're interested, I see some people have started to write where they're joining this event from. So please write your name and what city you're joining from this wonderful part of the world. I don't know about the UK and the US, but actually today we have more of a British weather here in Palestine rather than Palestinian weather. It's a bit cold and chilly. So we miss the sunshine that we had a few weeks ago. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and many friends. We'll be starting in the coming minute. So dear friends, officially, we're starting another Kumi session. My name is Omar Harami. I'm going to be, I have the blessing and the honor of being the facilitator for today's meeting. Sabil is launching the 9th booklet of Sabil. These booklets Reverend Naeem has been working on during using the time of COVID to write down his reflections and updating a number of publications. Today is a very important booklet. It addresses the issue of Christian Zionism. We're blessed to have both of our friends, Don Wagner and Stephen Sizer, joining us from the US and the UK. Thank you, Reverend Sizer and Reverend Wagner, for being with us today. We're also, it's always a pleasure to have Reverend Naeem with us. For many of you who are not aware, every Thursday, Sabil holds our traditional weekly wave of prayers and Bible study online. And we've been doing this since a few months after COVID. We have missed only a few weeks in the past 3 years. Most of these events or worship services are led by Reverend Naeem, the co-founder of Sabil and the father of Palestinian liberation theology, an inspiration to many of us around the world, but especially here in Palestine. Reverend Naeem, we would like you to briefly introduce the booklet, Sabil, or your new booklet, 9th booklet on Christian Zionism. Assis Naeem.
Thank you, Omar. And thank you all for being with us today. And special thanks to Don and Stephen, who will be leading us in maybe not only introducing, but trying to really help us understand this phenomenon. Just a few words before I give it back to Stephen. I became fascinated with this phenomenon of Christian Zionism since the early 1960s. I did not know anything about it before then, but I was at university in Texas when I when I met few American friends that had a connection with Nazareth back home, actually with an orphanage which was run by Americans. And my sister, one of my sisters, was working there. And anyway, through these connections, I met this group of American women and men in Texas when I was going to university there, doing my undergraduate work. And it turned out that this group of Christians were very strong Christian Zionists. And that's when I became introduced to it. I became fascinated with it and did quite a bit of writing, quite a bit of reading and studying about it, and then writing about it. So this little booklet is just an introduction to what Stephen and Don will be helping us to understand more about it. And this phenomenon is really, whether we like it or not, it is a Protestant and evangelical phenomenon that started in the 19th and 20th century. It is actually based on a literal understanding and interpretation of the Bible. And it really corrupts the biblical message of love, justice, and peace. And so that's why I really was attracted to it and wanted to really know more about it, which I have done, reading a number of books about it. But today we are dealing, we're having these two scholars who have done much more research than I have done. And so I want to turn to first, I think, Stephen, and then later Don Wagner. And then I will ask some questions. And I hope those of you who are with us will give your comments and ask more questions later on. With that, I'm going to stop and ask Stephen to start us off with this. Thank you. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you. Well, it's a delight to be with you today and to share in this Kumi Now. Thank you, Omar, for organizing it. And thank you, Naeem, for writing this amazing little book, Overcoming Christian Zionism in the Quest for Justice. Can you see my screen? You can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay, let's begin with a definition. What is Christian Zionism? Well, this is a definition that you'll find on the website christianzionism.org. Christian Zionists believe that the modern state of Israel is a continuation of biblical Israel and therefore should enjoy special privileges. And that includes the responsibility of Christians to support the state of Israel and its policies. Well, what are the historical roots of Christian Zionism? The roots, you'll find, again, in Naeem's book, he mentions individuals who wrote, Christian leaders who wrote about their aspiration to see the Jews return to Palestine. But as a movement, Christian restorationism really began and can be dated to 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte became the first world ruler in nearly 2,000 years to promise the Jews a homeland in Palestine. He was trying to defeat the British, and in order to do that, he felt Jewish support, France could achieve its objectives. And so he made this statement: Bonaparte, commander-in-chief of the armies of the Republic, French Republic, to the rightful heirs of Palestine, Israelites, she, France, offers you at this very time Israel's patrimony. Rightful heirs of Palestine, hasten. Well, Napoleon was not able to deliver, but politically, Britain, having defeated France, took on that mantle and saw the strategic significance of supporting a Jewish presence in Palestine. And that concept found its theological roots in what became known as the Albury Circle. Albury is in Surrey in England. It was the home of Henry Drummond, who was the High Sheriff of Surrey. He opened his home in Advent, 1826, Advent, the time when we think about the return of Christ. And then every year at Advent, he held a conference bringing together British political leaders as well as Christian leaders to speculate about how the end times were being worked out geopolitically and the role the church would play in the end times, and in particular, at the significance of the Jewish people. Theologically, until that time, the dominant view within the mainstream churches was one that I think you can identify with, meaning we have a covenantal theology. There is one people of God, Old Covenant, New Covenant, and there is a continuity in Scripture between God's progressive revelation through Israel and through the coming of Christ and the church, i.e. there's one people of God. Two individuals responsible for a dramatic shift were participants in those conferences at Albury. The first was Edward Irving, who was a Scottish Church of Scotland, and he founded a church in London, and he had a significant influence over the churches because his end-time eschatology was very pessimistic. And he argued that God had a separate plan for the church apart from Israel. And so it was really the birth of what we would call dual covenant theology, which you see today in the Dutch Reformed Church in particular. The other person was John Nelson Darby, who, similarly to Irving, argued for two peoples of God, but through dispensationalism argued that the church was the heavenly people and the Israelites were the earthly people, and never the twain shall meet. And so references in the Hebrew scriptures to the Jews, Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple, they were arguing were postponed until the end times. And they always saw the end times as their generation, just as people do today. And so the church and the coming of Jesus was really plan B. It was a parenthesis to God's continuing purposes for Israel. This is the bedrock of Christian Zionism, be it a dual covenant or dispensationalism. What was the significant element in all of this was the way in which these ideas about a restored presence, a Jewish presence in Palestine, coincided with British strategic political agenda, as we saw with Napoleon. And so Lord Shaftesbury in the 1840s was publishing adverts in the London newspapers calling upon European leaders to restore the Jewish people to the land of Palestine in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but also in the fulfillment of their colonial agenda. So the popular expression, which although Herzl didn't write it, he was popularizing, a land of no people for a people with no land, was actually written a generation earlier by Lord Shaftesbury, who predicted or anticipated a country without a nation for a nation without a country. Similarly, when Theodor Herzl wrote The Jewish State, it was actually preceded by a similar work by William Heschler, who was the Anglican chaplain in Vienna, who wrote a book called The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine. And these two individuals were close friends. And although if you read any Jewish work on the birth of Zionism, you will find little, if nothing, about the influence Christians played in the birth of Zionism. But in Herzl's own diary, he talks about William Heschler, and this is what he says. The Reverend William Heschler, chaplain of the English embassy here, came to see me, a sympathetic, gentle fellow with a long grey beard of a prophet. He is enthusiastic about my solution of the Jewish question. It's almost like Herzl is surprised that Christians are enthusiastic about his agenda. We've prepared the ground for you, Heschler said triumphantly. I take him as a naive visionary. He gives me excellent advice, full of unmistakable, genuine goodwill. He is at once clever and mystical, cunning and naive. And the significant role that Heschler played was to introduce Herzl and other early Zionist leaders to the influential politicians and monarchs of the countries in Europe that had a vested interest in Palestine. And it came to its consummation in what was known as the Balfour Declaration. Balfour was sympathetic to some of these theological ideas, although he also had anti-Semitic traits. You may or may not be aware that the Balfour Declaration, which the British government issued in October 1917, was actually drafted by the Zionist organization. And if you compare the two, you see the similarities and differences. The Zionists expected Britain to give Palestine as the definite article national home for the Jewish people. The British government was going to offer Palestine as a national home, but at the same time protect the rights of the non-Jewish communities. Not all of the British cabinet were impressed or enthusiastic. Sir Edwin Montagu, who was a Jew, warned the British cabinet that Zionism was a mischievous political creed. And in an angry memo to his fellow cabinet members, he declared the proposal would be anti-Semitic in result and prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. And the irony is that the British Board of Jewish Deputies opposed Zionism for this same reason. They saw it as a threat to Jews if they were being forced to go and live in Palestine. But what is really duplicitous about the British government's position is that in a letter published in 1919 from Lord Balfour to Lord Curzon, he admitted, for in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, rooted in age-long traditions, in present or future hopes, is far profounder import than the desires or prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. And then this was probably the most honest statement from a British politician ever printed. He said, so far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in terms of the letter, they haven't always intended to violate. And that's because Britain and France had entered a secret deal in 1915, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that having defeated Germany, they would divide the Middle East between the two empires, the British Empire and the French Empire. So Syria and Lebanon and parts of Turkey would form part of the French Empire, and Palestine, Jordan, the Gulf states and Iraq would form part of the British Empire. And that was the declared agenda from 1915 really through to 1947. And as you may know, when the Jews and the Arabs both realized that Britain was not going to respect their claims, their exclusive claims to Palestine, the partition plan was a very cynical attempt to enable Britain to extricate Palestine and allow the Jews and the Arabs to fight each other over Palestine. And so that was the partition plan, 3 segments like a chessboard for the Jews and 3 segments for the Palestinians. neither side contiguous. It inevitably led to war, and the outcome was the map we see there, and then the Golan, the West Bank, and Gaza were occupied in 1967. Christian Zionism as a modern movement really came alive through a succession of Christian presidents in the United States. Jimmy Carter, for example, claimed that the establishment of the nation of Israel is fulfillment of biblical prophecy and the very essence of its fulfillment. Jimmy was very influential in building links with Menachem Begin, and that marriage or coalition was brokered by Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell Sr. boasted that he could mobilize 70 million conservative Christians and 200,000 church leaders for Israel. This gives you some idea of the size of the movement, even in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, again, deeply imbibed with this apocalyptic dispensational eschatology. He said on one occasion, I turn back to the ancient prophets in the Old Testament, signs foretelling Armageddon. I find myself wondering if we're the generation that's going to see it come about. Well, thankfully it didn't. But then George Bush Jr. Expressed his own Christian convictions. He said on one occasion, I've been driven with a mission from God. God would tell me, George, go and fight these terrorists in Afghanistan. And so I did. And then God would say, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq. And I did. And now again, I feel God's words coming to me, go and get the Palestinians their state and get the Israelis their security and get peace in the Middle East. And by God, I'm going to do it. Well, he had a good try, but he didn't succeed. Obama, slightly more skeptical. Nevertheless, the first event as a new president, the very next day, he appeared at an AIPAC conference. Let me be clear, he said, Israel's security is sacrosanct. It is non-negotiable. Followed by Jerry Falwell commenting on Trump. Trump, he said, I think evangelicals have found their dream president, reuniting Israel with America. And as you know, Trump has probably done more damage to the Palestinian cause than any other president since. But more recently, Joe Biden, he said recently, the connection between Israel and the American people is bone deep. The generation after generation, that connection grows as we invest in each other's dream together. 25% of American Christians, according to the Pew Research Center, believe it's their responsibility to support the nation of Israel. And 63% of those are white evangelicals. They believe it's their responsibility. So this is primarily a white evangelical movement. There are three strands within Christian Zionism. There are the Messianics, Jews who believe in Jesus. They have primarily a religious agenda, although they out-Zion the Zionists in their own words. Then there are the apocalyptics who are preoccupied with the end times, people like Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye. And then there are the more pragmatic Christian Zionists who have a political agenda, like Pastor John Hagee and Donald Trump and so on. Just to give you an idea of the size of this movement, John Hagee said recently, he said, the sleeping giant of Christian Zionism was awakened. There are 50 million Christians standing up and applauding Israel. Think of our future together, he said. 50 million evangelicals joining in common cause with 5 million people in America, Jewish people in America, on behalf of Israel is a match made in heaven. My point at this is simply to emphasize that Christians outnumber Jews 10-1 within the Zionist movement. It preceded Jewish Zionism by at least 50 years, and it dominates Zionism today. And if you're still unconvinced, here's a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu. He said recently, I don't believe that the Jewish state and modern Zionism would have been possible without Christian Zionism. We value our friends and we will never forget them. Christian Zionism is a product of white supremacism. As you know, the slave trade gave way to segregation. Segregation inspired Aryanism and Nazism in Germany, as well as apartheid in South Africa. John Stott said recently, anti-Semitism in Germany and apartheid in South Africa seem at first sight so different from one another. Nevertheless, the theory of race on which both systems were built is almost identical. So is and I can't see my text, which many Germans and South Africans have expressed that they are destined to rule and must at all costs preserve their racial purity. That concept of racial purity, destined to rule, is what we see in Hafrada, in Zionism in Israel today. It's inspired by what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust in Germany, as much as upon the model of apartheid in South Africa. The word Hafrada simply means apartheid. So how does Christian Zionism impact Palestine today? Very briefly, two ways. We have subjugation of the Palestinians, and we have sequestration, the theft of their land. Palestinians kicked out, and the land is stolen. The agenda of Christian Zionism is very clear and very ruthless. We find them lobbying the White House and parliaments all around the world, Congress, and so on. George Bush Sr. admitted on one occasion there were 1,000 lobbyists on the Hill lobbying Congress for loan guarantees for Israel, and I'm one lonely little guy down here asking Congress to delay its consideration of loan guarantees for 120 days. The most powerful man in the world describes himself as a lonely little guy. The Israel lobby is a powerful lobby. These are just some of the organizations involved in it today. The second strand of their agenda is to assist the Jews back to Palestine. And so International Christian Embassy and others are literally transporting Jews from Russia, Eastern Europe, from Africa, and assisting them to settle into the occupied territories in particular. Third element of this agenda is the supporting the illegal settlements in Palestine. Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is one of those organizations committed to helping churches adopt a settlement, fund the settlements, justify the settlements, and even to adopt and support individual IDF soldiers. Some of the IDF soldiers today are actually American young men and women who feel it's their duty as Americans to go and serve in the army in Israel. And they have support from the Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, planting trees to erase Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And as you know, Trump acknowledged the settlement program as integral to Israel. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem was the fourth plank in their agenda. The International Christian Embassy, as you may know, was founded in the home of Edward Said's family. And through their work and through pressure from Zionist groups, they persuaded Trump to make it part of his campaign agenda to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem. And that took place. And it had the support of some very few countries, actually, but the majority abstained. But the irony is, Trump couldn't understand the impact of his move. He said, we moved the capital of Israel. Notice that. He didn't. He moved the embassy, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He was moving the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. And he said, that's for the evangelicals. You know, it's amazing with that. The evangelicals are more excited than the Jews. Isn't that fascinating? Fifthly, to defeat and silence their critics, the Zionist agenda is to demonize those of us who stand for human rights, for Palestinian rights, and equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which has been utterly discredited, is nevertheless being rolled out as a new definition of anti-Semitism that equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And at the moment, there's pressure on the UN to adopt it. Supporting the Temple movement, for a moment of light relief, we've got people like Gershon Solomon and the Temple Mount Faithful committed to rebuilding the Jewish temple. His approach, no different from the zealots of the first century. We must have a war the Messiah will not come himself, we should bring him by fighting. And every year in the feast of Tishbat Eve in July, they take their cornerstones as close as they can get to the Temple Mount to lay the cornerstones for the new Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And this is a picture taken from Christians United for Israel's website. You'll notice, looking at the Haram al-Sharif, there is one building missing, the Dome of the Rock. But there are plenty of books being written today by Christian Zionists advocating the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. They're even trying to breed the red heifer. This is Clyde Lott, a Mississippi rancher, Pentecostal rancher, trying to breed the perfect red heifer so that temple sacrifices can begin again. Finally, you find Christian Zionists fueling the conflict. This is the saddest element of their agenda. Franklin Graham in the Charlotte Observer said the Arabs will not be happy until every Jew is dead. They hate the state of Israel. They all hate the Jews. God gave the land to the Jews. The Arabs will never accept that. You know, that's shocking language from a Christian leader. John Hagee, Iran is a clear and present danger to the United States of America and Israel. It's time for our country to consider a military preemptive strike against Iran. This is provocative language, and the worst of all, Ann Coulter. She said after 9/11, we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, convert them to Christianity. We weren't punctilious about locating and punishing only Hitler. We carpet bombed German cities. We killed civilians. That's war, and this is war. Can't believe she said it, but this is the tip, if you like, of Christian Zionist leadership and their provocative stance toward Israel and Palestinians. That's their agenda, and that's why this book by Naim is so important. Christian Zionism is a deviant, in my opinion, pseudo-religious movement justifying colonialism, racism, supremacism, segregation, and apartheid. If you want to know more about what I've written, go to stevensizer.com and you can access my books for free. Lots of material there. But today we are focusing on Naim's book, Overcoming Christian Zionism and the Quest for Justice. It's a brilliant, concise booklet. I commend it, and I hope you will go and buy it. You can get it from the Fosner website. Just go to the Fosner bookstore. It's there, $5 for the print version and $1 for the PDF. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sizer. That's why you are the authority, together with Don Wagner, on the topics of Christian Zionism. We will be sharing the links of how to get the new booklet from Sabil in the chat. But now we move to our good friend Don Wagner from the USA. Don?
Thank you, Omar. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Stephen, for that amazing overview on the history and the theology. And I just commend what Stephen has written to all of you with this overview. How are we on time, Omar? I can condense my remarks a little bit if needed.
No, please take your time, Don.
Well, yeah, we want to leave time for Q&A. I'm going to be a little bit different. I'm going to make about 5 points and some suggestions. I mean, this little booklet that Naim has done is just absolutely brilliant. And it's a wonderful foundation for understanding and calling us to the urgent situation. I love how you begin this piece with the little group in Texas and you coming from Palestine, never having heard about dispensationalism in this kind of theology and the shock you must have been in. It reminds me of my parents and grandparents, what I grew up with. Loving, caring people, but with this bizarre Western theology. So my first point would be maybe to underscore that this is a Western imposition theologically and politically on Palestine. And I think you could draw that out a little bit more. This is a bizarre Western heretical abomination in a way. and emphasize how Western it is. Its roots are in Europe. And then it's a theology of empire, as Stephen has just demonstrated. It justifies imperial colonization of Palestine. And therefore, it's very, very dangerous. So that would be my first point. Expand a little bit on the Western false theology that has been imposed. And if you think of it, when Christians were living together before the British Balfour Declaration, people got along. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were really get along. And then gradually it began to deteriorate because both the Christian Zionists and Zionism began to colonize Palestine, all as a Western imposition, and it still is such. So I would just recommend that you kind of expand on that. Second point, the definition of Christian Zionism that you have there, I think fits primarily this evangelical, or I think better fundamentalist form of Christian Zionism that Stephen has laid out, both the restorationist and the dispensationalist under Darby. It fits that. And I would add to that definition, when I first wrote something very similar, but I emphasized that it calls for Christians to provide political, economic, and religious support for the Zionist movement. I would highlight that aspect because that's exactly what Hagee and the rest of them are doing. The political support is very, very important and clear. Third, I think we are beginning to realize how Christian Zionism is absolutely booming in the global South. We haven't paid enough attention to that. We're working with Stephen on a new project. I'll tip it off, it hasn't launched yet. The Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism. And when this launches, it will provide a digital library of what's going on globally, what has already happened, which Stephen has resourced so well, but also we have friends in South America, Central America, who are trying to combat Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is booming in Africa and parts of Asia, Taiwan, even inside China, the Philippines, Korea, South Korea particularly, bringing hordes of people. And Netanyahu is looking at these areas for his support politically, as well as for Hagee and the rest. So I think the growth in the global South is something you could just mention in a paragraph that's very, very important. Fourth point, I really appreciate you emphasizing the growth of Christian Zionism in the mainline Protestant churches. This is a different theology, a different historical development. You mentioned Niebuhr rightly, and this is still very much alive. This post-Holocaust type of critique of anti-Semitism that is embracing the IHRA definition and marketing it in the churches. We certainly see it, and Stephen's been a victim of it in the Anglican Church. We see it in all of our mainline denominations, Episcopal, Presbyterian, and so on. Although there's a counter movement that's very strong, I think we have to name that as a very different theology and call it Christian Zionism, because it basically embraces and supports Zionism. And a different version of it we find very strong in the Democratic Party today. Joe Biden, I don't know if he's a Christian Zionist, but he's certainly a Zionist. Hakeem Jeffries, the group that's had a huge delegation in Israel right now, is very much alive, and we have to name it and critique it and and you've done that, and I think it could just be expanded a bit. Then I would suggest a fifth point we were mentioning before we came on, the work of Michael Pryor. Michael had a huge impact on me and on Sabeel. And I just commend Sabeel through the decades of dealing with Christian Zionism. What Michael Pryor did was he introduced me and many of us to settler colonial analysis, political analysis, and blended it with liberation theology. This is our foundation to challenge Christian Zionism and political Zionism. This blend of settler colonial analysis, and just to highlight it, settler colonialism is more lethal and different from traditional colonialism. Settler colonialism replaces the indigenous people. And of course, that's what our country did, the United States. And this is what Israel is doing today. And that is exactly what Zionism and the Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and settler movement is doing. This displacement, replacement, and then providing a justification of it from the Bible. So I think we need to name that, highlight it, and I'd recommend a little bit more on that and what you've done. And then finally, you mentioned some of the films and resources. I'd like to make a couple suggestions. I'd recommend adding the film Till Kingdom Come. This was to show on public TV in the United States, and the pro-Israel lobby blocked it with help from the Christian Zionists because it exposed a couple very important things. Really, the director is an Israeli, and she did a brilliant job. Get this film and take a look at it, because one of the things it does, it exposes how Christian Zionist movements like Hagee's, and then the one from Rabbi Eckstein, the international, I'm blanking on the name right now, that movement is raising tax-exempt funds that support the settlements and the Israeli army. And this tax-exempt funding is something we really need to address. Hagee's support, some of which goes right to the Israeli military and the settlements, is tax-exempt. Many of the pro-Israel lobby organizations, tax-exempt funding. This loophole in the IRS system in the US, but it's also all over Europe, needs to be closed. And that is a challenge that we really need to take on. So finally, my final suggestion was, how does this impact the Palestinians? Stephen's laid out some of it. And I'd like to suggest that Omar is working on this with Bible studies all over Palestine. And I think there's a need for a powerful indigenous Palestinian liberation theology that's popular at the grassroots, at the bottom up. It needs to be aware of this history and what Christian Zionism is doing, but rather than be on the defensive, it needs to be grounded in liberation and resistance and reclaim the theology of Jesus and the Hebrew prophets with hope, with empowerment, that we will never be defeated, but to popularize this at the grassroots level, to be inclusive, working with progressive Jews and the Muslim community, explain the false theologies of Christian Zionism, the dangerous ideology of Zionism, but have a popular, non-defensive, hopeful, affirming movement from the grassroots up. And I think Sabeel is doing that, and other Christian communities are doing that, often not getting help from the institutional church, But that's where we need to be in solidarity from the West and all over the world, affirming the power of the local Christian. So that might be another thing to look at as you close the book out. But thank you for a brilliant, concise resource. This is a great instrument, so let's read it. And I think we need another conference hosted by Sabeel, Fazna, and maybe many other organizations to move us into a new dimension of liberation. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Don Wagner, Reverend Wagner. I think many around the world, many Christians around the world, we were shocked and terrified at the moment by Christian Zionism. But I think it's many in the church have organized, we're able to respond, and we're holding our ground, and we are also gaining momentum and power all around the world. The topic of Palestinian Christians and justice and Palestinian liberation theology, contextual theology, in major conferences around the world, we're always invited, we're always present, our books are present, seminaries are visiting our countries, listening to us. So we're also doing a very good job, and we're creating an alternative to the narrative that they are providing. And this is thanks to many theologians and many people of conscience and many of our friends around the world who know what's happening in Palestine, and we're exposing them and we're chasing them, defending the true message of Christianity, the message of liberation and freedom. Reverend Naeem Atir, if you could please unmute yourself. We know that you have prepared some questions for both Reverend Sizer and Reverend Wagner.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Don and to Stephen for what you shared with us. I really wonder, in spite of all that has been presented so far, I really like to know, is Christian Zionism waning? Is it really becoming less of a problem than it was in the 20th century, when it was much more alive? Is it still alive in the way it's being practiced? It is true that that many non-Western countries or people that have been affected by it in Africa, in Latin America, and other places, in Asia. So this is one question that I'd like to ask. I just want to mention several of them. Please just make a note of them, because I don't have too many, because I really would like to get the people themselves to ask questions. Another question for Stephen is that why was the Anglicans, maybe the evangelical Anglicans, fascinated by Christian Zionism? And they were, so many of them were very active in its beginning. And so this is one question that has to do with the Anglican Church, or one segment of the Anglican Church that were part of the leadership of that. Another problem for Don that I'd like to ask, is dispensationalism still taught in? My impression is that dispensationalism is not mentioned that much anymore. It's not taught in seminaries, mainline seminaries. At one point, Dallas Theological Seminary was very much in the center of the debate of dispensationalism. And Moody Institute in Chicago was, what has happened? Has things shifted? to other third world countries where it has become much more popular. These are some of the things that and then maybe one other question that I want. Has Christian Zionism now been suppressed by the rise of Israeli Jewish religious exclusive extremist settlers and their use of the Bible against the Palestinians? These are some of the thoughts and some of the questions that I had in mind that I wanted to really raise. And maybe after you give us some your question, your answers, maybe Omar can try to see what other remarks or questions other people may have to offer at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Assis. So Don Wagner and Stephen Sizer, who would like to go first?
Well, I'll start. Sorry, Stephen.
No, you go for it. Go for it.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Naeem. Very right on questions. Is Christian Zionism declining? I think it is being challenged by progressive evangelicals and even mainline evangelicals in North America, the US and Canada. And I think polls are going to show there's a decline. Some of it's a reaction to Trump and the extremism, but it hasn't gone away. So I think it's yes and no. But I think it is growing, and we need to do a lot more research. I'm not really up to speed on the global South. I'm just a little bit, but I think it is still growing, say in Brazil, Guatemala, some of the Central and South American countries. Certainly you find it in Nigeria. And you find both the mainline liberal, or I would say the mainline Christian Zionism in parts of Africa, but also the end time, Nigeria. And then certainly in South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, and these groups are bringing a lot of people to Palestine, Israel. At the same time, I think you raised another question that's important. Is there a counter opposition coming from these extremists like Ben-Gvir and the settlers? And yes, some of them are very anti-Christian and they're involved in attacking churches, priests, and so on. So that is a dimension, and Omar can comment on that much better than me. So that is an element, but yet these other groups are still coming, and Netanyahu needs them and will support them, as will others like him. So you're still going to have the Hagees and some of the others. Now, finally, the question on the seminaries. I don't think our mainline seminaries, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Lutheran, and the rest, are teaching this. We really need work, hermeneutical work from the seminaries to deal with this. They're not preparing pastors and even the laity to deal with these issues. And I don't know. I don't think it's taught at Fuller Seminary. Jesse can comment on that. I think it's on the wane in even some of the mainline evangelical. But Moody and some of the harder right-wing fundamentalists, yeah, it's still taught. So those would be some of my observations.
If I can add to that, thank you, Don. I appreciate your comments there. My observation, first question that Naeem asked was about whether it's growing. I agree with Don. I think we're in a plateaued in Europe and perhaps in America because of the use of social media. The younger generation of evangelicals are much more savvy, much more aware of what's happening on the ground, much more likely to be sympathetic to a Palestinian perspective. But where I'm concerned is in the developing world. I was with a lady from Malaysia this morning, and they're very concerned about the Christian churches in Malaysia. that are influenced by the American churches, Pentecostal, the prosperity gospel, independent churches. So in the same way that Darby's views of dispensationalism penetrated the world through their missionaries, I mean, I've met Palestinians who are dispensationalists, and they were the product of Brethren missionaries in Palestine. So in China, Malaysia, India, contacts there where they're concerned. Africa, there's been a new book published recently, Christian Zionism in Africa, certainly in Latin America. So I think that's where the Zionists are targeting the churches. They're going to the developing world and talking about prosperity gospel, for example, and linking it to blessing Israel. So I think that's the influence is growing worldwide, if it's plateauing in Europe or in America. But in terms of what's the link between the evangelical Anglicans and Christian Zionism, if you go back to the early 19th century, you could not stand for parliament if you were a Roman Catholic. The nonconformists were really second-class Christians. The Anglicans were the established church, meaning that bishops sit in the House of Lords. They're part of the government. And so, whereas in the States you separate church from state, in Britain we fuse the two together. And you see this in the coronation of King Charles III. The role of the church is very influential. So at the birth of Christian Zionism was born out of evangelical Christians whose theology and their politics came together. If you look at the theological writings from the 1820s through to about 1870, 1880, the idea was simply this: the Jews will repent, they will become Christians, and God will return them to the land as a Christian nation. So it was evangelistic, utopian, naive, but they were planting Christian nations all over the world: Canada, South Africa, India. You know, they were Christianizing the heathen, the pagans, the Maoris, the Aborigines, and so on. So Palestine was simply one further extension of European colonialism. But from 1870 onwards, as more and more Jews were returning to the land without Jesus, they flipped their theology. So it was return, then repent, in the view that they would return to the land as unbelievers, and then they would get religion, then they would come to faith. So their theology flipped because history and contemporary events didn't fit. So it's remarkably similar to the writings of Hal Lindsey predicting, you know, the rise of communism in Russia, and it was going to be the Antichrist, and it wasn't Russia, so it becomes the Arabs, and it becomes the Muslims, and it becomes Iran. After it was Iraq. You change your theology based on what's happening on the ground. So that's why Anglican evangelicals had such an influential role in the birth of Christian Zionism.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're recording this session from its beginning, and we will be sharing it with everyone who have attended this meeting, and we will make it also public on Sabil YouTube channel. But I have a question for either Don and Reverend Sizer. We know throughout the history of the church has had a very strong position in defending against false teachings in the church, teaching any new teaching that would come, that would sound, that is anti-dogmatic of the traditional church. As we know, Christian Zionism is not is foreign to the church throughout its history. Why were the churches somehow they've accepted the existence of Christian Zionism, and they had a less strong stand when it came to fighting it? You are on mute, Reverend Sizer, and Don.
There was a seismic shift in the worldview of the church around the time that Christian Zionism was a movement, Christian restorationism from the 1820s onwards. And that was their view of the future. The reformers were largely amillennial or postmillennial, believing that the church would reach the world with the good news of Jesus, the world would be saved, and then Jesus returns. At the end of the 18th century, and the beginning of the 19th century, you had the Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, and then you had the Revolutionary War in America. Then you had the Civil War, and then you had the succession of wars in Europe. And so the mood became very pessimistic. And in that pessimism, you see the rise of the sectarian Adventists, the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists. They were all predicting the end of the world in their generation. And that was true of the Brethren as well. So they were very pessimistic about the future. And so if the future was condensed, you had to fit a lot of the Bible into that short period. And they were convinced the temple's got to be rebuilt. And for the temple to be rebuilt, the Jews have got to be back in the land. And so there was a push to see these things happen before Christ returned. So it was a very pessimistic view of the future that fueled a theological change from being optimistic to being pessimistic. And we still see that today in a lot of the books selling in Christian bookstores.
I'd like to take a little different tact, although I totally agree with what Stephen's saying. When I went to seminary in the 60s, I was introduced to liberation theology and really gravitated toward it. But I also was introduced to Niebuhr and the post-Holocaust theology. And I think that took hold in a lot of our mainline churches and seminaries, and is still very strong today. That's why I think we need to critique this other mainline post-Holocaust theology and challenge our seminaries and our denominations. And that is happening. There are grassroots movements, our PIN groups, the pro-Palestine advocacy groups, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopal, all of them have PIN groups who are working on this. And it's a long struggle, but still, I think the leadership at the top in many ways are very susceptible to accusations of anti-Semitism, and the push of the IHRA definition continues. So that's why we need to be advocates, this counter movement, to challenge all of this. I would add too that there's a new movement that the PIN groups are going to be working on called apartheid-free communities, where we are going to be called upon to study apartheid, settler colonialism, and see if our churches will take a pledge of being apartheid-free communities. And I think if that takes hold, that can have a huge impact on our denominations, the mainline. But still, it's a real uphill battle. And I think of Germany, many other places in Europe, where the post-Holocaust critique is very strong. And I want to affirm, we have to be truly sensitive of real anti-Semitism.
Yes.
But the way it's being manipulated to cancel critique of Zionism in Israel, we can't stand for that and need to continue our resistance.
Thank you very much, Don. We continue to encourage people who have questions. I see many have had comments in the chat, but people with questions, we would encourage you to include your questions in the chat. What is the most effective way to combat Christian Zionism in general for a lay person when they encounter it in the church? Don? You are on mute, Don. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay, how's that? I think there's several things. I think to be very aware of the theology, and to be sensitive to what type of Christian Zionism you're dealing with. Are you dealing with the fundamentalist type or the mainline? And you have to address them separately. I think the most powerful thing we have in our favor is the role of the Palestinian Christians and the call for solidarity of Christians, Muslims, and Jews to really work for justice, liberation, equality, and to not be afraid, to be very hopeful. But the solidarity with the Palestinians is absolutely essential. So centering Palestinian voices, be they Christian or Muslim, and getting people to develop a relationship, even locally, with Palestinians is important. Join one of the groups and denominations, the PIN groups, be it Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, right on down the line. They have resources you can work with. Don't do this alone. And the solidarity with Palestinians, but also with others in your denomination is very important. Look at what the denominations have passed. You have resources that are amazing over the last decade or two, but they're not filtering down to the local pastor and the parish. But you've got resources galore in your denominations. And then FASNA, Sabeel, and many other groups, Kairos, Palestine, they all have tremendous resources, not just for study, but really for advocacy. And advocacy is absolutely important, be it BDS or this anti-apartheid movement. So be not afraid, be hopeful, but resistance and affirmation of the power of the prophetic message of Jesus and the prophets is key.
Reverend Sizer, any comments?
I think Don has said as much as I'd want to say, other than perhaps to add that our Sabeel groups around the world are so important in showing solidarity and in combating things like Christian Zionism in our own countries. So I'd commend folk listening to this who perhaps are not yet active in their Sabeel, Friends of Sabeel, in their country. Please take this as an encouragement to do so. And perhaps an early plug to say that next year we're hoping to run an international Sabeel conference, which will look at religious extremism. And there will be a strand, presumably, we've still got to work it out, but Christian Zionism will feature in that as a form of religious extremism, along with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and so on. So that's something to look forward to once we're able to go public with dates and so
on. I want to add one more question or a hint, a tip from people with lots of experience, like both our good friends, Don Wagner and Reverend Sizer. In the past year or so, in the past 16 months, there has been over 17 joint statements by all church leaders. In the past 5 years, there has been dozens and dozens of Christian-related organizations, human rights organizations, faith-based Christian organizations that have made statements and calls to the wider Christian community by both evangelical churches, mainstream churches, Catholic churches. Everybody has spoken that there is a problem, that the local Christian community is facing problems. The statements vary within their strength and with their with what the issues that they address, but it's clearly that there's a problem in the Holy Land. Many Christian Zionists still refuse to listen. What would be if it's if it's human rights does not open their hearts and their ears, and Christian and the churches, local churches, does not open their hearts and ears? neither does the theological work with scripture, with looking at the Bible. What would be a way to get into the hearts of our Christian brothers and sisters who use theology to oppress us?
My suggestion on that would be to help them realize that Christian Zionism as an expression of European colonialism is defending and justifying apartheid, i.e. let's use the success of defeating apartheid in South Africa and the recognition that it's wrong, morally wrong, theologically wrong to view people differently based on their color, their ethnicity, and so on, and to treat people as equals. So challenging Christian Zionism as an expression of apartheid is one side, and the other is campaigning for a one democratic state. I know not everyone agrees with that. Some still are wedded to the two-state solution, but I believe that emphasizing the need for democracy and equal rights for Palestinians and Israeli Jews, alongside challenging what is becoming more and more obvious that Israel is practicing apartheid, is the way to help Christians particularly to realize that Christian Zionism's theology is defending apartheid in the same way that the Dutch Afrikaner Church justified apartheid. That would be my agenda, to go for the Achilles heel.
I absolutely affirm that. I think we need to do a better job to describe how urgent the crisis is. We've let Christian Zionism get away with a lot without being more aggressive and assertive. But I think we need to hear, and we in the West need to highlight Palestinian voices. What's happening in people losing land, the daily murder rate of how this militant Zionism is being normalized by Christian Zionists, be they liberal or fundamentalists. I think we just need to be much more aggressive in highlighting what is happening on the ground. And it's not getting through to our mainline media. And it's got to be a grassroots movement from the bottom up, because the Israelis and the pro-Zionist groups can still silence a lot of the media with guilt. But I think we really need to be much more aggressive. We also need to work harder at getting people over there, and that's going to be more difficult, so that they get on trips. And Black churches, they're being lobbied heavily by the Zionists. Evangelicals, we need to get people on the ground so they see for themselves, and then mobilize their efforts with their elected officials. We must be much more aggressive in pushing our officials. And now we've got a new bill on the detention of children. Betty McCollum has a new bill. We need to be able to get 50, 75, 100 Congress people on that. But it's not going to happen unless from the grassroots we're working on that together as churches. So that's another way to begin to break through.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, friends. Assis Naim. Reverend Naim Atiq.
Yeah.
Yes, Assis.
Yeah. Just I couldn't turn off the. I cannot turn off.
Turn on the.
Yeah.
You're okay. We can hear you.
Add. I think
We
it's,
can hear
I
you,
think,
Assis.
yeah. No, this is fine. I mean, it's. I appreciate the discussion. I don't know. Are there other questions that Omar from the chat or from other people that want to ask?
I think we covered all of the questions, Assis.
I think Reverend Fahad Abu Aqil has a question.
Fahad has one.
Yeah.
But we'll only make an exception for Reverend Fahad Abu Aqil.
Okay.
I just want to emphasize, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
I want to emphasize the importance of going after Africa and Latin America for the simple reason. The Presbyterian Church General Assembly only deals with Presbyterians in the US, but the United Methodist and the Episcopalian or the Anglican, it's a worldwide deal. So look what happened 6-7 years ago. Methodist met in down in Tampa, Florida. I mean, that conference was planning the worldwide conference to take a step forward, and it was a Nigerian bishop who stood on the floor of that assembly and said to them, God gave the land to the Jews, and what you're doing is wrong. Everybody got quiet. So I think we really need to follow Reverend Wagner and Sizer dealing with Africa and Latin America. I mean, Christian Zionism very strong. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Reverend Fahad. I agree with Reverend Fahad, and we will use the last words of Reverend Fahad Abu Aqil. We need to chase Christian Zionism wherever it is, because Christianity is good news. It's God came to liberate the oppressed, to open the eyes of the blind, and to set the captives free. This is our faith. This is what Christianity is. We're proud of it, and we're going to share the good news. Wherever there is a need for it, we will go there and share it. Thank you, Reverend Don Wagner. Thank you, Reverend Sizer. Thank you, Assis Naim, for being the father of liberation theology, for initiating this amazing movement of Palestinian liberation theology, for giving a voice to the voiceless. You inspire us, you continue to inspire us, and we're blessed to have you among us. Thank you all for being with us. I hope you got the book, and please make sure that you read all of the different booklets that Sabeel has been launching in the past few years. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Naeem, and thank you, Omar.
Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Don.
It was a good
Thank
number.
you all. Thank you all for everyone. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful program. Appreciate it very much. Yeah. Thank you, Omar.
Enjoy the rest of your day.